So we talked about microgravity. Let's talk about microgreens as a source for food.
How do you know about microgreens?
I mean, it's the internet. You know, everything I know is from the internet. And you just admitted that you run a lot of things in NASA, and you just get on the internet too. So I just want to encourage everybody, even if you get an important job one day, you're just going to be on the internet Googling things. Don't get fooled by these people. They're all faking it until they make it anyway. So
like a public
microgreens.
Service announcement.
Yeah, I just want to encourage people to get online and search stuff that's interesting.
Yeah.
Because at the end of the day,
But you got to vet it.
Yeah, I mean, you have to check your sources, and you have
Right.
to cross-reference, and you have to use common sense, and yada yada yada. But hopefully, you learn that in school.
Right.
So that's what your team kind of works on is solving some.
Well,
you're trying to feed. You're basically a chef for space.
We're not the chef.
Well,
we're the supplier.
You're the supplier
of
for the chef
of the
for
products.
space.
Yeah.
Right. But you still have to work with. As I was listening, you still like if it was just about supplying product, I think you would have an easier job. But you, like you mentioned earlier, you also have to take into consideration the psychological effects of the food that you're delivering. So that's something that you mentioned in one of your podcasts, how you could survive off of a certain food, but psychologically, what is that? And what is it like to maintain plants in space for a long period of time?
So you'll get, this is very interesting because I have this happen all the time, and even at the highest levels. You'll get people who say, look, I can make this shake out of microbes, and it could, let's say it provides all the nutritional support that they need, everything that potentially the prepackaged food system is going to lose efficacy on the key nutrients. You can drink one of these shakes and you're good to go. And that's not what the food technology people, they work at the Johnson Space Center in Houston. The Human Research Program is basically, that's where they're basically housed. And one of their components is advanced food technology. So advanced food technology is trying to work up prepackaged food that'll last with all the nutritional support needed for as long as possible. They're the ones who come up with diets as well. They work with the chefs and the nutritionists. They have nutritionists, and they come up with that diet. The Human Research Program is looking overall health of the crew. So they're looking at their physical health in terms of exercise, medical, things like that. So every different parameter. But one of them is the psychological benefit too. And I know from their perspective, they look at it that crews going to missions that are long duration missions give up a whole lot. They give up time away from their home. They give up familiar surroundings. They can't do the things they do. So they want to make sure that their food, which is a real source of enjoyment, is there for them. It's something that they can count on. They don't want to have to force them to also drink some kind of green sludge shake that tastes like lawn clippings and say, hey, if you drink this every day, you're good. Because the data kind of shows that if crews don't like certain things, they will not eat them. And what we're trying to, and they will lose weight as a result. So what we're trying to do is make sure they have a type of diet that they're going to enjoy, that they're going to eat and consume to keep them healthy, let them do the mission that they have to do.
But you also don't want them to have to be full-time farmers, correct? So you don't want to go too far in the other direction where they feel the weight of being basically a farmer all day long and not get all these other important things done, correct?
When it comes to being a farmer, I think
that's a very dumb term.
That's actually a good term.
But a general term to
that's actually a good term.
Describe that. Because I wouldn't want to do that. If I'm in space, like I would be annoyed being like, you have to go water this and do this. And I'll be like, I'm going to float around and do other things.
Questions, and I have like 10 different versions of an answer to give you.
Okay.
The first thing is that for microgravity flights, for these missions that we're actually flying to a destination, like the moon or Mars, especially Mars. The moon, prepackaged food will last fine. It's just days away.
I'm just going to stop. I still have a difficulty understanding or putting those two in the same category because it's 3 days to the moon and it's 2.5 year round trip to Mars.
So it's interesting. We're going off again into a
That's
different
all right,
direction.
but I've been meaning to ask you this because I think if you're just listening to this podcast, you don't know how long it takes to get to Mars.
A key thing to keep in your mind is that the moon is pretty much always about as far away from Earth as it is. So when we say a couple of few days to get there, no matter what time of year, that's where it's going to be about. When you're talking about Mars, our planetary orbits, the orbit of the Earth around the sun and the orbit of the moon, Mars around the sun, are such that at different times, that distance between the Earth and Mars varies greatly. And one of the ways I can talk about is communication. If you had an astronaut in a station on Mars, depending on where that station was in terms of its distance with Mars from the Earth, a round-trip communication could take anywhere from 6 minutes to 44 minutes. Now, right now, as we're talking, Mars is in one of the closest proximities to the Earth that it's been in a long time, supposedly. I read that on the news. All right. But, that difference is substantial, and that's not the kind of dynamic we have with the Moon. So when we're talking about going to Mars, you either have a small window of opportunity to get there, do something quick, and get back, or you have to wait a substantial period of time till that planetary alignment is beneficial enough for you to make the journey.
See, I think that as I'm trying to understand this, I'm really, I'll not just you in general, I'll ask you a question or I'll read something online about, and I'm thinking Mars. I'm thinking, we're going to Mars, we're trying to solve how to go to Mars, live on Mars. And sometimes a lot of the answers to that, and they're referencing what we're doing on the Moon or the ISS, and in my simple brain, I'm like, that answer doesn't apply to going to Mars. It applies to what we know about going to the Moon. They're two different animals in a lot of ways. Am I missing something?
I think that from a food production perspective, there are different technologies in terms of how do I land. When I go to Mars and I've sent our rovers there, I've used these big balloons that come flying in and they smack into the ground and then they deflate and the rover walks away. And that type of use of parachutes and things like that requires you only going to certain places on the surface.
Like we have to land in the canyons in Mars because of the atmosphere,
we have to land where
right?
there's enough atmosphere that the chutes can actually slow you down. We can't land in the higher elevations where there wouldn't be enough performance by the parachutes to slow the vehicle down before it crashed into whatever it was crashing
And plus,
into.
as a person who wants to grow food, you got to have a say in where we land too, based upon the regolith.
It all depends if we're using regolith. Then I would imagine that if they come and ask us, our say would be like 1/2 of 1% of the list of priorities.
They've picked a spot and they're like, Ralph, what do you think about this spot?
They would tell us, here's where we're going. If you want to use regolith, you got to figure out how to make it work.
Okay.
But to go back, if I have a surface habitat, whether it's on the Moon or whether it's on Mars, the operation, with the exception of the difference in the gravitational field, should be fairly similar. So the technologies that I bring into that aspect of this habitat should be fairly similar.
Okay. Well, I'm still going to push back on this until I understand it. If I were going to Orlando, but if I was going to Seattle, you pack the car different. I guess it's the same car, right? But it seems like you can take what you can get away with due to the closeness of the Moon, you cannot get away with due to the travel
the thing.
of
I think
Mars.
To map what you're saying to what we're doing, when I go to the Moon, so the vehicle that we're building next is called the Gateway, and that is going to be a small station. It keeps getting bigger over time in the past couple of months, but it's going to be a small station it's called Cislunar orbit. It's not really an orbit around the Moon. It's an orbit between the Earth and the Moon. It's a halo orbit is how they're referring to it. And there's a lot of different variations in that orbit. They can move it around. It's got a lot of good rationale to be there. But if I'm on these missions to the Gateway, right now, because of other vehicle performance, they're probably not going to be any longer than a 30 or 60-day mission. The parameters for feeding the crew based on those timelines are no different than the International Space Station. We've had people on the International Space Station. It's been permanently staffed for 17 years. Yeah. We ship up the food to them, and they eat it. We have enough access to the station that we can ship up and resupply. That's what we're all about in terms of what's been a big push for commercial space with SpaceX, et cetera, was supplying the space station. Going out to the Cislunar Gateway, it's not much difference. It's a couple of days to get there. So the food, from a food perspective, I can ship up the food for those missions. It's the missions going out to Mars that take so long that the food may not be as nutritionally viable after on the return journey. That's where I need to support it with fresh food. And I'm not replacing it, I'm supplementing it in that environment.
And that's one of the biggest things I think I've learned in the past couple of days is going back to that silly example of going to Orlando or Seattle. I can pack enough food to go to Orlando. It'd be like trying to go to Seattle, not being able to stop,
right? Without
to get
being
food
able to get
or fuel or anything. Like it's
Right.
not like the SUV that I stocked is not going to get me to Seattle without.
Right.
So that's
Right.
what you guys are trying to solve.
Right.
Essentially.
From a food perspective, yes.
And fuel. I mean, you're not working on fuel, but on all fronts.
Yeah, and there's a big thing to keep in mind too is that when we look at the space station was built on a paradigm where if a system breaks, I can ship up one
Parts, yeah.
fairly quickly. When I talk about missions to Mars, I can't do that. So I pretty much have to design hardware to be really resilient, make it very reliable, make it so that instead of changing things out, I can maintain it and fix it. I would like to have components that, regardless of the system, I have a common set of components,
interchangeable with
or
whatever.
that I can manufacture in place.
3D printers.
Things like that. So
great.
it's a whole new paradigm when I start talking about getting away from the Earth. One thing I can tell you is that when I look at the water system on the space station, right now it's 90% of the water is recycled. Okay. When we start talking about going on missions to Mars, we want to up that to like 98%. So I'm looking at a different design philosophy and a different concept of operations potentially too. When I do things in LEO on ISS, I have a mission control in Houston, that's the station control center, and they are up and staffed around the clock, 365. And if there's problems, they're very instrumental in coming up with the solutions for those problems, and the astronauts kind of will work their solutions. When I'm talking about having something on Mars with a 44-minute potentially communication delay, the systems have to be smart enough to figure out what the problems are, and the astronauts would be a component of that solution. And when the problem is solved, they'll relay back to the Earth, hey, we've done this, and they will be saying, yep, okay, that looks like the right way to do it. So it's a whole different operation philosophy too.